All right, good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started as people roll in. If you do have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I'll be fielding the questions and we'll do them at the end, or if anything is pressing at the moment, we can also answer those during the presentation. We will be sharing a screen, so you won't see our faces, but we'll have the PowerPoint up on the screen and you guys will be able to see that. So Barb, if you want to get started.
Yes, surely. And Carly, remind everyone that it is being recorded for later also, okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm Barb Kaufman, Director of Prevention Services at Prevention is Key. I am so excited to see nearly 150 people registered for today, the first of our 5-part series, Becoming Trauma Attuned. This is a topic that becomes more important to me as I learn more about it. Just last night, I was reminded of the importance of being trauma attuned as I participated in a webinar, Take a Walk in My Shoes, and as I watched a movie, The United States versus Billie Holiday. Very different presentations, of course, but both prime examples of the impact of trauma on our lives and the need to understand it and respond effectively to it. So I am convinced of the importance of this 5-part series, and I'm so privileged to partner with the CTARI Institute, which is the Prevention and Education Training Division of their parent organization, the Center for Great Expectations, both leaders in trauma-informed approaches, substance use treatment, and behavioral health treatment for adolescents and their families. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Deborah Broussard, a part of the CTARI Institute and a senior CTARI trainer. Deb, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, for the introduction. Let me share my screen, get that going. Okay. So I'm very excited to be here launching the first of your 5-part series that my colleague Frank Piccone and myself will be presenting to you, and I get to go first. Today's presentation is an overview. I am going to be giving you a lot of information about trauma, and I've titled it 10 Things Everyone Needs to Know, because we need to know this as clinicians, we need to know this as family members, as lay people, as community members. But any one of these topics, you can go really deep and get a lot of information, more information about it. And some of that we will touch on in some of our future presentations in this webinar. So it's a lot. And hopefully you'll have some good questions that we can have a little bit of a conversation when I'm done. So I like to start with defining trauma. Okay, I like to really try to broaden everybody's understanding of what is trauma, because I found in my work as a clinician, as a supervisor, as a psychotherapist, that people's understanding of trauma is often very narrow. Okay, so we start with identifying trauma as an event, a particular event, a one-time traumatic event, like a serious car accident, like an assault, sexual assault, a physical assault, like being caught in a weather disaster, tornado, a hurricane, an earthquake, right? An event that is so frightening that you feel like you're going to die, and people are impacted by that in different ways, but sometimes it results in a PTSD diagnosis. So that's a one-time event, okay? We also think about trauma as a series of events. Okay, so these are events. This is something that happens over and over again, a traumatic experience that happens over and over again, of which the person cannot escape. When we think about this type of trauma, it's the child who is trapped in a family where he or she is being physically abused, sexually abused, verbally, emotionally abused, okay? And it happens over and over again. There's no way out. We think about this type of trauma when we think of the domestic violence victim, who is in a relationship that's abusive, that's dangerous, and they cannot escape. Prisoners of war, also we think about this, being trapped, okay? And with children who are in this abusive, family being abused, we call this complex trauma. It's not an official diagnosis in the DSM, but it's a complex trauma because they're exposed to multiple traumatic events often that are interpersonal. The third way of thinking about trauma is thinking about absence of the good. There are things that we need as human beings when we are enter into this world that we need to survive and thrive, okay? We need shelter, we need a caregiver to take care of us, we need food, we need clothing, we need things to survive in the world, an adult to take care of us, because as newborns and infants, we cannot take care of ourselves. We also need things that help us to thrive as human beings as we develop and grow. We need a secure attachment relationship. We need caregivers that value us, that help us to see our worth, that give us a strong sense of self. And when you don't have that, when you have a caregiver who is misattuned or absent or abusive or neglectful, that is trauma. And the research shows us that the absence of the good is actually can be more negatively impactful on an individual than sexual and physical abuse. Okay, so very profound impact of this type of trauma. We also, adverse childhood experiences is another way we think about trauma. And perhaps many of you on this call, on this presentation, have heard about ACEs. Hopefully you have, because New Jersey has been really working towards creating ACEs initiatives in our communities and as a state. But the adverse childhood experiences test study, it was in the 1990s, and really began to make the connection between the traumatic experiences we had before we're 18 and the difficulties we have in life as adults, okay? And they have lasting effects on health and well-being, both personal and environmental. In fact, the adverse childhood experiences understanding has increased, has broadened to include environmental ACEs, environmental experiences, and they call that the pair of ACEs, right? The environmental traumas like poverty, like inadequate housing, violence, lack of economic opportunity, community disruption, discrimination based on race and culture. And so that's adverse childhood experiences. But trauma is also the racial, cultural, religious, and gendered oppression that some individuals in our communities experience on a daily basis. This is trauma, and our country is right now grappling and trying to understand and shift our racial discrimination and stereotypes and institutional structures that support it. But it's also cultural, religious, and gendered oppression that we have to be aware of the impact on us, our friends, our clients, our communities. And then finally, historical trauma. So this is really a new area of research that trauma researchers are looking at. It's the trauma of a people's that is passed on through generation to generation. So we think of the Holocaust, the trauma on the Jewish people from the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors, and that they're actually studying the genes of their children and their grandchildren and finding that there's genetic impact of being a descendant of a Holocaust survivor. And this is the whole world of epigenetics, if you've heard of that. And it's a very new area of research. So they're not developing a lot of solid conclusions, but they're learning a lot about how trauma is passed on through the genes. And I know that in indigenous people is the same thing, that it just generation after generation is suffering because of trauma that's done to their ancestors. And so this is trauma. This is how I think about trauma, and how I'm hoping that you can begin to think about trauma. So how many people have experienced trauma? So this is where the ACEs study has really broadened our idea of how insidious trauma is, okay? So they studied, the initial study of the ACEs studied 10 different interpersonal household type of trauma. And they asked people, if before the age of 18, were you emotionally abused, physically abused, or sexually abused? Were you emotionally neglected or physically neglected? Did you experience these challenges in your family, domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation, or an incarcerated parent, okay? And so they discovered that I think they studied over 17,000 participants in this study. 36% of that group said they had no ACEs, which means that 63% sorry, I'm not good at math on the fly, had experienced at least one ACE, right? And that people who experienced one ACE were more likely to have more than one ACEs. And so how many of these things you experience becomes your ACE score. So between 1 and 10, and that really then that identifies the risk of all of the health and well-being that you experience as an adult. And in regards to substance use, right? So substance use is one of the ACEs. 27% of the study participants reported this as an ACE, okay? And so the ACEs study continues today, okay? And aces2high.com, where I got this, this graphic here, you know, is where you can find the new research, and these statistics still hold true. And in fact, they're including more ACEs in the study, such as bullying, such as more environmental ACEs as well. Okay, so the risks of trauma, okay, so the experiencing trauma sets you up for the risk. So the study found a very strong correlation between the number of ACEs, your ACE score, and possible risk outcomes. So people with ACEs, ACE scores, are more at risk for having just a lack of physical activity in their life, a higher risk of being addicted to smoking, of developing an alcohol use disorder, of developing a drug use problem, IV drug use, of missing work, of experiencing severe obesity, of having diabetes, depression, having suicide attempts, having contracting a sexually transmitted disease, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, broken bones. The risk is exponential for these at the higher your ACE score goes, right? And some of the statistics are pretty sobering. Excuse the pun. But ACEs and the risk of substance use is what, since I work in the substance use field, this is really where I am focused on, and really, this really cemented for me the connection between trauma and substance use. So the higher the ACE score, the higher the chances of addiction to alcohol and other drugs in adulthood. So the ACEs study shows us that if you've experienced 4 or more ACEs, it doesn't necessarily matter which ACEs, there's 4 or more, you have a 500% increase in risk for developing adult alcoholism. Now the risk is compared to somebody with no ACEs, okay? Men who have 6 or more ACEs, they have a 4,600% increase in risk for developing an IV drug use problem. And for women, 78% of IV drug use in women is attributed to adverse childhood experiences, right? So these numbers are big, right? And this really, to me, means that we need to focus on trauma, particularly when working with substance use, but also with all populations. Trauma increases someone's vulnerability to addiction. And there's 2 ways that we see this happening. There's other ways too, but these are the ones that I really focus on, right? So somebody who has a trauma history, it has a decreased capacity to regulate their emotions or their bodies or their actions, right? And so substances initially are taken to serve as an alternate means to self-regulate, right? So someone takes a drink, smokes a joint, takes a pill, right, and feels better because it actually regulates your nervous system. But over time, first of all, over time, it's the substance that was a solution to the problem becomes the problem, but also using substances deepens the dysregulation in the attachment system in the individual's nervous system. All right, so it actually makes it worse. People who have trauma histories have a compromised ability to form healthy attachments. And so substances are used as a way to form attachments, right? They can calm social anxiety. Take a drink and you feel a little better in a social situation, right? Helps people connect with other people. Peer groups, young people often discover substances as a way to connect with their peer groups, right? And also intimate partners. Oftentimes substance use is what draws people together and what keeps them connected, okay? And so it helps to attach to other people. So I'm going to show you this brief video. Gabor Mate is a medical doctor who spent 15 years in the downtown east side of Vancouver in Canada, treating, there's a community of individuals who actively use heroin who live in this part of Vancouver and have created this community, and they have a medical center there and a safe injection site. a lot of harm reduction. He was a doctor there. And so he really began to understand the connection between trauma and addiction. So I am going to show you this brief video because he can speak for himself.
All the substances of abuse, whether they're opiates or cocaine or anything else, they're actually painkillers. Some of them specifically are painkillers. But physical pain and emotional pain, the suffering is experienced in the same part of the brain. So when people suffer emotional rejection, the same part of the brain will light up as if you stuck them with a knife. The Eckhart Tolle says very nicely that addictions begin with pain and end with pain. So that all the addictions are attempts to soothe the pain. So when I work with addictions, the first question is always not why the addiction, but why the pain. And what you find is emotional loss or trauma. In the case of the severe addicts, as in the downtown East Side here, they were every single one of them traumatized. There's no women walking the streets here who had not been sexually abused, not even by accident. But you know, whether it's a sex addiction or internet or relationship or shopping or work addiction, these are all attempts to get away from distress. Keith Richards, the Rolling Stone guitarist, said, who used to have a severe heroin habit, as you know, he said that all the contortions we go through just not to be ourselves for a few hours. Well, why would somebody not want to be themselves? Because they're in too much distress and too much pain. So I don't care what they tell you about genetics or any of that choices or any of that nonsense. It's always about pain. Well, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, it's got a wonderful line in it. Whatever you do, don't try and escape from your pain, but be with it. Because the attempt to escape from pain is what creates more pain. And that's the reality with addiction. But the question is, how can people be with their pain? Well, only if they sense some compassion from somebody. So as another teacher says, only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth. So addicted people need a compassionate presence which will permit them to experience their pain without having to run away from it. And all the attempts to run away, it's like another teacher says, the surest way to go to hell is to try to run away from hell. So you gotta be with that pain. You just have to be with it, but you have to have some support. And we live in a society that one way or the other is always about instant relief, quick satisfaction, distraction. In other words, we live in a culture that is based on, both economically and psychologically, on not supporting people to be with themselves. So it's always the quick getaway. So it's very difficult to deal with addictions in a society. But yeah, it is a matter of, at some point, finding a way of being with your pain so that you can actually get to know what it's really all about.
Okay, so there's a lot in that. I encourage you to watch that a couple of times on your own. So this is important. Vince Felitti was one of the primary investigators on the ACEs study. And he was the one that really looked at the connection between substance use and trauma. And this is a quote from him that's always stuck with me. Our findings are disturbing to some because they imply that the basic causes of addiction lie within us and the way we treat each other, not in drug dealers and dangerous chemicals. They suggest that billions of dollars have been spent everywhere except where the answer is to be found, right? And it's much easier probably to launch a drug war that, if you don't know this, has been pretty much ineffective in stopping the flow of drugs to this country. It's much easier to launch a drug war than to prevent child abuse and neglect, domestic violence, and other familial trauma. So. Number 4, what does trauma do to the brain? Okay, so I want to help you with your brain. This is a little picture of a brain. I want you to take your right hand or your left hand, hold it up. I want you to put your thumb in the middle of your palm and pull your fingers over top of your thumb. This is a model of your brain. From the bottom of your palm down your wrist, right, is your instinctual brain. The reptilian brain. If you open up your fingers and see your thumb, that's your emotional brain or your limbic brain. And if you take those fingers and pull them over your thumb, that's your thinking brain or your prefrontal cortex, okay? And so this is our brain. I'm going to use my hand as I talk us through this. So that's why I'm telling you why my hand is up like this, right? So let's talk about the brain's alarm system, right? Our brain is amazing. It keeps us safe. We take in sensory information from our environment. We see things, hear things, smell things, taste, feel things. And when danger is perceived, this amygdala, an alert is sent to the amygdala, and it's also sent to the prefrontal cortex, right? The amygdala's role is to determine if we're in danger or not, if our survival is threatened. And if we are, it will secrete those stress hormones, cortisol being one of them, that initiate an instinctual response so we'll be safe, that fight-flight response, okay? The prefrontal cortex, its role is to assess the situation, predict what's going to happen, and make a choice as how we're going to respond, okay? Fortunately for us, in many situations, the amygdala works much faster than the frontal cortex, and we react when we're in danger to bring ourselves to safety before our brain has time to think about what just happened, right? The close calls and the car accidents, the you're jumping out of the way of a dangerous car coming down the road, right? Thankfully, we have that amygdala that works fast. But often we begin to react before we realize that we're not in danger. And you maybe had those experiences where you feel a little sheepish and embarrassed that you jumped out of the way and nothing was there, right? But that's our brain doing what it does. Somebody who experiences trauma, it changes the brain. It decreases the ability for the frontal lobes to work, because when you're in danger, those frontal lobes go offline. And if you are in constant danger as a child or as an adolescent, that frontal lobe shuts down and continually goes offline and doesn't develop and learn. The limbic system gets really sensitive, right? They've actually shown in fMRIs that those parts of the brain are actually bigger. They're hyper alert to danger all the time. There's a lot of impulsivity, difficulty managing emotions, because that limbic system is like on alert all the time. The hippocampus, which is part of that limbic system, is less effective, right? This is the part of the brain that interprets information from the environment to the brain, and it makes it difficult for us to differentiate real and imagined threats, which is why individuals with trauma histories, one, are more likely to be traumatized because they don't sense the danger that's there. Hippocampus is not working to sense the danger, and the opposite is true. They sense danger all the time. Number 5, what trauma does to the body. So not only our brain is affected, but our bodies are infected. And a lot of this information comes from Bessel van der Kolk. He's a trauma researcher. He wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. If you've never read it, I highly encourage it if you're interested in understanding trauma, okay? So based on this idea that what trauma does to the body, in the moment of a traumatic event, the body goes into that instinctual response. The brain sends out the alert, our body responds to survive. Once we're safe, right? The body naturally releases stress and cortisol through shaking, right? And so if you ever had that experience where a close call in a motor vehicle or whatever, and your body starts to shake, don't stop it. That's the body's natural way to get rid of that cortisol. For people who have experienced trauma, and in that moment of trauma, they could not fight back and they could not escape. Think of the young child being abused. If you fight, you're going to get hurt. If you try to run away, you're going to get hurt. And so you don't do either. The nervous system stays on high alert to survive and constantly pumps cortisol into the body, right? And so chronic trauma, if it's always pumping, the child is always alert, is what the danger is in the household, the body adjusts, the nervous system adjusts, right? And cortisol takes its toll on the body. And that's where we get the hypertension, the heart disease, and all the chronic illnesses, right? And the movement that individual could not make in the moment of trauma, that they couldn't fight or flight, that actually gets stuck in the body, gets stored in the nervous system, right? And it's part of trauma work. I work through the body of how to try to move that through the body, because people's bodies begin to just get borne down by that. Number 6, right? Trauma triggers, right? Such as loud, angry voices, being rejected by a friend, screeching car tires, a car backfiring, right? These are trauma triggers for people who have experienced trauma. Triggers are things that happen in our current daily experience that remind somebody of a past traumatic event, whether it's a cognitive memory, an emotional memory, or a body memory, okay? The body does not have a sense of time, okay? Time is a cognitive function. The body doesn't have a sense of time. So in that moment of the trigger, the body reacts as if that original traumatic event is happening right now. Okay. And so people are often unaware of the connection between what's happening now and their past experience. So they feel very much out of control. They feel very crazy, right? Many clients be so relieved when they understand that, oh, they're not crazy. This is just what their body does when they're triggered. It's like, oh, it kind of makes sense. It's like a relief, right? They're so afraid that someone's going to tell them they're crazy, or they don't tell anybody because they're afraid. And actually, just a note to COVID-19. COVID-19 and this pandemic and the social isolation, there's a lot of trauma triggers for many people, and they're struggling. We continue to struggle. Number 7, how do we react, right? So we've talked about that. In the moment of trauma, the body starts to fight, flight, or freeze, right? This prefrontal cortex shuts down, goes offline, the limbic brain takes over and launches those instinctual responses, right? Without any thought to guide them, right? And so that happens in the moment of trauma, and when they're triggered, the brain responds in the exact same way. So thinking brain goes offline, deactivates, limbic system shouts alert, 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 and the person becomes furious, terrified, enraged, ashamed, right? Fearful, frozen. These are some of the things that they put out there. And sometimes the trigger is known, and sometimes it can be so subtle that the person is unaware of the trigger, but the body senses it. And this type of reactivity can go on for years. Substances are often used to reduce this trauma reactivity, right? People who can use opioids, alcohol, to kind of stop that anger and that fear, calm it down, bring the body into a calm state. Or for people who tend to freeze and collapse into depressive modes, they might use a stimulant to just motivate the body, because the body's responding and it needs something to counteract that. That's what substances do for people. And when they stop using those substances, right, suddenly the trauma starts to happen more. The trauma symptoms show up again. So the first month in residential treatment, if you ever work in residential treatment for someone who stopped their substances and they have a trauma history, very, very difficult for both clients and staff. Trauma symptoms can be managed. Okay, this is the hopeful part, moving into the hopeful part, right? The symptoms of trauma include these things: depression, irritability, insomnia, nightmares, overwhelm, numbing, hopelessness, shame, worthlessness, flashbacks, panic attacks, substance use, eating disorders, self-harm, more, right? One of my mentors, Janina Fisher, will say, trauma survivors don't have memories, they have symptoms, right? This is what comes up. And understanding the connection that these symptoms have to past traumatic experiences is the very first step in managing them. Because trauma is stored in the body, often the best place to start is with body-based interventions. Until that body is calm, that nervous system is dialed down, that someone actually has a few strategies that can bring them to a more relaxed state, so that limbic system can calm down and those cognitive brain can come back online, then they can start to learn all the information that they need to learn about their substance use, about their mental health issues, about their coping strategies, right? And so my way of working is to start with the body with many people, to give them a little bit more ease in their body. Not quite so hypervigilant, not quite so on edge, okay? Teaching emotional regulation skills is important, and cognitive strategies, all useful, but sometimes the timing is important to shift it up a little bit. Responding to people with trauma. Okay, so this is for all of us. People who have trauma histories often behave in ways that are difficult, right? And people all around us have experienced traumatic life events, right? If you look at the ACEs study, more people than not have had trauma in their history, and we don't often talk about it. Many people are very quiet about it. Many people are in treatment for it and don't even tell anybody, right? And we don't know who they are, and we don't know what their life experiences have been. People we work with, right? People we in our community, our neighbors, people we worship with, right? But as these individuals interact daily with others in personal, in social, and work environments, sometimes their responses, which we are now seeing as trauma reactions, can be difficult for others to handle or understand, right? Think about this, impulsivity, like doing things without thinking, right? Which often leads to mistakes and misinterpretations, right? And not working as a team. Quick and overreactive frustration or anger, like that hairpin temper, like boom, 0 to 60 in a second, right? Or those individuals that shut down, refuse to talk. Or avoidance, there's a little bit of conflict and that person suddenly is nowhere to be found, right? So these are some of the things we see that potentially are trauma reactivity, but if we don't have that lens, we can get very reactive back to that, right? These behaviors can trigger reactions in us that are not helpful, right? We can get angry, we can get frustrated, we can get dismissive, offended. I'm disrespected, I'm offended by that. That was very disrespectful, right? We can start to avoid those people that are difficult and not want to work with them and not want to be on work teams and not want to be in a group with them, right? And if we or you have your own trauma history, sometimes this reactivity back to that behavior is your own trauma reaction to being yelled at, right? To being dismissed, to being disrespected. So then we have this just trauma reactivity just really getting larger and larger. If we take what we know about trauma, we can hopefully respond rather than react to difficult behaviors in other people, because we don't know what life experiences might be fueling these behaviors, right? And this is another thing about understanding substance use. If you understand substance use as really an adaptive coping strategy early on in life to adapt to a very horrific, terrifying, dangerous situation, if you can see substance use through that lens, it makes room for a more compassionate response rather than a judgmental, shaming response, right? And also with kids, right? When kids have trauma reactions, we label it. They're acting out. We need to punish these bad behaviors. We need to, reward and punish. And this, it's hard to, if we don't understand what's driving those behaviors, right, we're not going to be able to change them, right? And so we have to think about, what are we seeing in kids these days in school? It's a lot of traumatized children in our schools, right? Even now, and with COVID, the trauma is getting worse. There's familial trauma during COVID, it's getting worse. And we know that to be true. Number 10, there are ways to heal from trauma, okay? And I've divided in 3 different kind of categories. And the first is the body-based approach, right? Breath, movement, and touch, but breath is very important, right? Breath is connected to heart rate variability, right? And we can use our breathing to shift our heart rate variability. This is heart rate variability. A higher heart rate variability means that your heart rate can go up and down very easily based on the situation. That's a good thing to have, and it's associated with healthier cardiovascular system and a more balanced and resilient stress response system, right? And leads to overall greater health and longevity. And we can actually shift this by learning different breathing strategies. It can be an effective way in the moment to also reduce anxiety. And I'm not going to teach you any breathing strategies, but I'm going to tell you, right? If you intentionally make your exhale longer than your inhale, right, you are actually slowing down your heart rate and dialing down your nervous system and bringing your body to a more calm state, right? And so there's people that do breathing exercises and use that extended exhale, but there's power in that exhale. And I encourage all my clients to use it. Movement, right? Movement is very important. Moving that trauma through our bodies, getting it unstuck, getting those joints moving, places where we hold trauma, which is in our hips often, our hip area, our shoulder area, our jaw, and our face area, where we hold tension, where the tension from trauma and stress can be held. We need to move that. And so yoga, exercise, activities that involve both movement in the brain, like Bessel van der Kolk, he'll say, tell your clients to go learn how to do ballroom dancing, right? It uses your brain, but it also moves your body, right? And so it's like getting those 2 parts of yourself integrated, right? right? So movement is a very good way to heal from trauma. Touch, right? Now, as a clinician, we don't touch our clients generally, but there's a lot of value in self-touch and teaching our clients to hug themselves, right? To hold their hands in front of their vulnerable front body and just hold that, right? And feel that what that feels like to hug yourself. Weighted blankets are becoming very popular in our society, but also with clients, I have clients, use a weighted blanket. It feels like it feels like a hug, but it also has a calming effect on the nervous system. People that have restless leg syndrome are finding it nice to have a weighted blanket on their legs. Massages, facials, all those things we can't do right now during COVID, or maybe we can soon, right, are ways to get touch in a very healthy, healing way, okay? Emotional regulation is another way that we heal from trauma. Learning how to manage, right, that compromised ability to regulate our emotions. So grounding strategies, using the 5 senses to ground, looking around the room and identifying, what 5 things do I see, 4 things that I can feel, 3 things that I can hear, 2 things that I can taste or smell, 1 thing that I can smell, right? Helping people to ground with their 5 senses, bringing you into the present moment when you've gotten triggered into the past. And what strategies get us out of the emotional brain, strategies that you actually engage the cognitive brain to get yourself out of the emotional brain, right? I had a client who used to do math problems in his head when he got triggered because that got him thinking, and it literally calmed his amygdala down, okay? The other way to foster emotional regulation is to engage with safe relational connection, right? Our bodies are wired, right, with this vagus nerve we have that is wired through a social engagement system that, and this, think about the people that you feel the safest with, the most comfortable with, right? It's because when you're with them, your nervous system goes, oh, I'm safe. I don't have to be worried about anything, right? It calms our nervous system, right? And so I encourage individuals with trauma histories to identify those safe people and reach out to them when you're not feeling safe. And just talk to them, hear the sound of their voice, see them on a video. Maybe I always encourage people that I work with, go for a walk with that person, just be in their presence to calm your nervous system. And then cognitive strategies, right? There's some very, very valuable cognitive strategies that can be used to help individuals heal from trauma. Education, the power of education and information. Psychoeducation about what trauma does to your brain and what trauma does to your body, and how what happened to you impacts how you relate to people today. Very powerful. And it's a lot of what I do with my clients. I'm always reminding them of what we know about trauma and how it applies to them, right? And that basic, what's happening to you today makes so much sense because of what happened to you when you were a kid or an adolescent or a young adult, or what happened to you last week, okay? We can challenge those cognitive distortions that pop up. The beliefs that people have about themselves that were developed early on in childhood because of caregivers who taught them they were worthless or treated them poorly and made them think that they didn't have any value, that they were helpless, and challenging those thoughts that come up and replacing them with positive thoughts, right? It's not easy, but it's shown to be effective if we can help people begin to learn how to do this. And strengthening those executive functionings, our ability to problem solve, think, create goals, set up a plan, see what, evaluate the consequences, engage in creative pursuits, all these things, right, help that brain to grow and get back online, because those executive functionings for a child that was traumatized didn't develop because they weren't necessary for their survival. And so there's ways that we can build back executive function. So a little bit about prevention, because this prevention is key. We're left with these 2 really big questions. How do we prevent child abuse? How do we prevent substance use, right? Big questions, and really working hard as a community to think, because if these things don't happen, right, if we can find ways to prevent them, then we don't have to deal with the problems on the other end, right? And I don't know that we can ever prevent all child abuse, but we can certainly build resiliency, right? Resilience is the ability of a child or an individual to recover and show early and effective adaptation following a potentially traumatic event. Okay, this is from the NCTSN, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. What factors enhance resiliency in children? Support, right? From parents, friends, family, school, community, resources that buffer negative consequences in daily life, right? Like even just having community partners, agencies, places that children can go and be where they feel safe, right? They need to feel safe in the home, at their school, in their community, right? And sometimes we can't guarantee that safety, but we can find safe places, right? Particularly in communities that are not safe. High self-esteem is a factor that enhances resiliency in children. And high self-esteem, not all children have that, right? Some do and some don't, but if they have it, it can enhance resiliency. If a child has a sense of self-efficacy, that if they actually do something in their environment, it will be effective and they will make a change and they'll be able to meet their goals. That's self-efficacy, right? So a child who has that, right, is more likely to have stronger resiliency. Having a sense of meaning in one's life, that includes spiritual and cultural beliefs, connections with others, goals, dreams, right? Feeling like they belong, right? Having talents or skills, right? This is why we like to promote in children any interests and pursuits and talents. And yes, do that. Draw, play that game, excel in math. Yes, we want that because we want to enhance that innate resiliency in children. And coping skills, right? Children who have coping skills, and they don't all have coping skills. Children who do are more resilient. So we can look for ways to build coping skills in our children. Environmental factors that enhance resiliency in children, a strong positive relationship with a primary caregiver, right? We know from the research of childhood resiliency is that really, they only need one positive relationship, right? And not necessarily with a primary caregiver, but with somebody who loves them and cares them and tells them they're valuable. That can be enough that's a protective factor, right? To help build that resiliency. That strong family connection, a circle of family members who are committed to each other. They resolve problems together. They practice meaningful rituals and have predictable routines. Very important, but not all children have that, right? So then the schools can create a positive social environment that foster and develop cognitive skills and create safety and places of belonging. And this is actually a challenge now with COVID, right? It's hard to belong when you're on Zoom every day. A lot of children are suffering, we know that. And a community that ensures access to essential services, that the children have, there's good childcare, after school programs, healthcare, mental health, all those things that a community provides for safety and resiliency, okay? One last little video about moving from ACEs to resiliency to bring this to an end.
My father passed away when I was 8 years old, and that was really hard. And incarceration of a family member. I went through 6 years of abuse, ages 0 through 6. I grew up with a father that did drugs like meth, weed, alcohol, and he went to prison for it when I was 11 years old. And when I was a little kid, I thought drugs were good, and I started doing them when I was in the 3rd grade. I'm a sophomore now, I'm trying to get off of them, and it's hard.
Physical neglect, no. I typically would like search the cupboards and search the fridge and whatever, and like scrounge around for anything that I could eat, and typically there wasn't anything, so I didn't get to eat a lot. And then I got neglected pretty much in every other way.
My resilience card is hope. I developed self-esteem by realizing that I'm better than my past, that I've moved on from my past, and that I'm not what my past is, and I'm never gonna let my past get to me again.
Having clear expectations and rules, that's giving me structure. It's giving me the knowledge of right and wrong, because there are some things that like I had a feeling were right and wrong, but was never really taught that way.
Learning responsibility helps me because one of my responsibilities here is working with horses, and I get to go out and trim horses' feet and ride horses, brush them, and keep my mind on that instead of things like drugs and just things that aren't good and things that benefit me and are good for me. Also, learning responsibility, it helps me take actions for my school, and now I'm gonna catch up and graduate.
Being able to witness success is, I feel like it's a beautiful thing for a person. It just shows that you work hard, that your work ethic got you to where you wanted to be. It kind of shows a lot of potential that you have in that certain thing that you want to be successful at.
I model appropriate behavior for myself and then for my future family, hopefully. Model it for myself more right now because I'm trying to break a cycle for abuse.
I knew how to drop in. Two of these guys didn't know how to drop in on the skate park, so I taught them how. They fell on their butts a little bit and hit their heads like me. But I taught them how to do it. They did it, succeeded it. And yeah, it was fun helping them out, helping me out. Made me feel good for myself. Made me happy. I felt like a teacher.
Why I thought I couldn't count on anyone after that to take care of me, so I thought that I had to do it all myself. And then slowly reaching out and being able to kind of get help from other people, and then to trust other people, you know, to let them in to help you out. Yeah, I realized that I could do that. And then, you know, in turn, I was able to trust them enough to talk to them about the things that happened, and then, you know, I was able to work through a lot of those problems. So that was a big one.
It's a rough life. It's not something you want to do. I got kicked out of school. I went to jail. Now I'm in Jubilee. And it helps. You got some friends here helping me, helping them. So yeah. You gotta fail in order to succeed. So there'll be a lot of obstacles in life that you have to climb over. You fall and you just have to get back up pretty much. And eventually, if you just keep going down that path of being able to stand up for, you know, what you want to be successful at, eventually success will find you. So. Sorry.
So I leave you with resources. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is an amazing resource. I actually had a fact sheet that I had asked them to share with you about child trauma and opioid use disorder. The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk's book, as I said, the amazing book. Judith Herman also has a good book. It's an older book on trauma and recovery. And I also encourage you to Google New Jersey Resiliency Coalition, because there's a ACEs initiative in New Jersey that I think everybody needs to be aware of and be a part of. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oh, wait, thank you from the CTARI Institute. And stop sharing and see if we have any questions that I can answer.
Yeah, I think we had a few come in. I'll just address quickly. We'll send out the recording and I have the PowerPoint with a little note section next to it that everyone will get. I'll send that out by the end of the day with whatever email you registered. With this webinar, I'll send that out. The first question, what does CTARI stand for?
All right, so I don't know if Frank Piccone is still here, but I can't answer that question because I wasn't part of creating it. Frank, are you still here?
I don't believe he is, but I can look that up too. And that was someone from our agency, so I'll let her know.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm like, sorry, I can't answer that question.
No problem. The next one, has trauma increased or has research uncovered the prevalence of trauma?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that research has uncovered it. I think trauma has always been with us and we've not been aware of it. It's increased our awareness, but it's also brought attention to forms of trauma that are happening, so it's being more disclosed and more recognized and more reported. But I believe that we've always had trauma. I know Freud discovered it and then put a squash on it way back then. It's something we don't want to talk about. Although I do, as I've said, I think during COVID, we've seen more trauma happening because of the circumstances.
Right. The next one, this one is about bullying. Bullying is a particularly difficult trauma because while it is happening, a lot of people stand by and let it happen, including teachers and parents. They believe that people need to be able to learn how to stand up for themselves, but if they don't have the proper support, how can they?
Yes, I absolutely agree. And having bystanders watching and not people that are supposed to protect you, not protecting you, just makes the trauma even worse for the person experiencing it. And I think that we have not understood bullying as we need to as a traumatic experience. I work with so many people that being bullied in school is the trauma that they're trying to overcome. And in fact, there was some research that I heard about recently that was just being done. It hasn't been published yet by a trauma researcher trying to figure out what trauma is most connected to substance use. Like they were trying to tease that apart. And for girls, they're finding that it's a sexual abuse in early childhood, but for boys, it's being bullied around age 14 or 15 that is mostly connected to developing a substance use disorder. So we need to be considering bullying the trauma that it is.
This next one, are we identifying trauma in white people more, and has that prompted more trauma treatment and resilience services? We know that trauma among Black Americans is hundreds of years old.
Yes, yes. So the question is, are we identifying more trauma in white people? Probably, and understanding trauma, but we're also recognizing that the centuries of trauma for Black people is something that we've been ignoring and overlooking, and that we need to acknowledge that as well. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, I think it was more of a statement as well. Just okay. What do you recommend for partners of trauma survivors to help them with self-care?
Partners of trauma survivors to give the message that self-care is not selfish, right? Self-care is necessary. And so to remind them that, but also to do with, to find things that are self-caring that you can do with your partner. And so finding activities enjoyable or, healthy things to do together as a way to do with, because people that have trauma histories, it's very difficult for them to even envision self-care as something that they're supposed to do and want to do. And so having someone to do with is very helpful.
Okay, I think we have two more. Why do you think that males seem to have more issues with coping than females?
I think, and this is, I don't try not to stereotype males, but I think men in general, I think they're raised to acknowledge emotional issues and to be able, to acknowledge that they're feeling a certain sort of way. They're raised, in particular in our culture, to be tough and strong and so if they're afraid or hurt or embarrassed or shamed, they're taught not to show that. And so I think that if for women who are allowed to be more sensitive and that they're allowed to feel things, and then they can develop those coping strategies. And for men, it's often like just anger. They go to the angry place, right? And so I think it's how we're raised. And so for men who are sensitive, right, very difficult for them to overcome trauma and to be in the world and to be understood because of their trauma. So I think it's how we're raised, and then not being able to process the emotions behind the trauma, it just stays stuck.
Yeah. Okay, and then how is COVID trauma anticipated to be similar or different from any other traumas?
how is COVID to be different or similar? Well, what it does for people who are trauma survivors, it reminds them of past traumas, social isolation, the fear of getting sick, the fear of loss, those kind of things, not being able to get, food. That's what happened in the beginning. So it's re-triggering old traumas for people who have trauma histories. For people that don't necessarily have trauma histories, I mean, I think we all have some things in our past that are triggering, but we're experiencing the social isolation as a traumatic event. And so I've been doing a lot of webinars on, you are being traumatized now. What can you do to build your own resilience so this doesn't have a long-term effect on you? And they're predicting, I mean, there's a lot of more mental health issues, a lot of people seeking treatment, a lot more substance use than people that never had substance use problems. How do we build resilience so that this pandemic is not something that is still impacting us individually and as a community and a society 1, 3, 5, 10 years down the road, right? Finding ways to heal now and to support each other and to build resilience.
And then I think we just have one more. You said that often people process trauma in different ways and can develop different addictions. Any advice to recognize these red flags that may be invisible? How do you approach someone who may be struggling?
Say that again, Carly. It's a big question. Say it one more time.
So you said that often people process trauma in different ways. How do we recognize these red flags that may be invisible? And then how do you approach someone who may be struggling?
Okay, so red flags may be invisible, people that, the thing, so we're going to see we may see the substance use, we may not because it's hidden, right? That's clearly a red flag, but it's the avoidance, it's the shutting down, it's the kind of curling into yourself, a difference in, a shift in a personality, like, a child, for example, who was outgoing and friendly and suddenly starts to not be that way and hide in their room and not want to come out, engage, right? We need to notice, we need to pay attention. We don't chalk it up to, it's just something they're going through. We stay engaged with them. And because we want them to know that it's okay to talk about. There's a lot of shame. So to take bullying, for example, a child starts to get bullied and they don't want to tell you because they feel like they're weak, particularly if it's a boy, but even girls do this too. And we want them to know that we need to talk about this. There's no shame in talking about what's going on with you. Families need to be open and talk about these things that are hard to talk about. You don't want to set up that foundation of, we don't want to talk about it. And you don't want to, if a child or somebody starts to say something to you and you don't want to hear it because it's like hard to hear, you don't want to shut it down. You don't want to give the message that you can't talk about it, right? So noticing difference of behaviors, of attitude, things like that, and having conversations. It might be trauma, it might not be, but either way, staying engaged with people is the way to get through something. It can't be a secret, I guess is the message.
All right, well, if anybody has any further questions, I think we're up for the time today, but Deborah, thank you so much. I already saw so many people in the chat writing how helpful and amazing this was. So we really thank you for your time. And again, everyone, I put the next webinar link in the chat. So if anybody would like to register for our next upcoming webinar, that will be March 10th at the same time. And that one is called How Trauma Affects the Brain.
May I say one word before we go? Firstly, Deborah, thank you so much. It was fabulous. And I thought, this one was the intro, the overview, whatever. And I thought might not be as good as the rest, but it was fabulous. It was done beautifully. My other, I just want everyone to know that on March 11th, and I think, Deb, you might know, because Frank is joining us, we will have our first Morris County ACEs work group meeting. And we are really hoping to be a part of the New Jersey Resiliency Coalition. We're working with him and the Governor's Action Plan. We've studied that. Excellent. So if you're certainly invited, and anyone is, I'm going to ask Carly to send that link to all the attendees also. And hopefully you can join us that day too. So again, thank you. Amazing.
I see in the chat, just really quickly, is there a link to the first video played? Just Google Gabor Mate, M-A-T-E, what is addiction? and it will pop up. So,
Great.
Yeah, and I can send that out. I'll find that on YouTube and I can send that out as well. So
okay, good.
yeah.
Thank you
All right, I'll
again.
see you guys back on, I think in 2 weeks, I'm back. So we'll see you.
Okay, see you then. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Join us again. Bye-bye.